بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ونشهد أن محمدا رسول الله سبحان الله نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستجيره ونستهديه ونستنصره فإنه حقا من هدى الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على النبي الأمين محمد المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الميامين وعلى أصحابه الطيبين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا رب نسألك أن تقسم لنا من خشيتك ما يحول بيننا وبين معاصيك، ونسألك أن تقسم لنا من رحمتك ما يقربنا من طاعتك، ونسألك يا رب أن ترزقنا من اليقين ما يهون علينا مصائب الدنيا وأحداثها. Today's khutbah will deal with a difficult and touchy subject, but it is a subject that must be addressed, and must be addressed frankly and honestly. Part of this khutbah will be technical, but it is not technical for the sake of technicality. Sometimes we have to address the technicalities in order to make way for a moral point. When moral perspectives and ethical perspectives are obstructed because of the technicalities, it is the job of a moral scholar and a moral jurist to negotiate these technicalities in order to make space for morality and decency. Recently, a well-known Muslim figure passed away. And this well-known Muslim figure was rather controversial because although he was an Imam who apparently was popular with young people and might have provided guidance and inspiration to young people, there were allegations of sexual misconduct. And as has become rather common in our community, the more rare situation is when the sexual misconduct is not dressed up in any legalities. In other words, the more rare situation is when an imam sexually abuses normally an underage, normally girl, some situations boys, but most of the situations I've heard of girls. And normally these girls are minors, and normally there's no pretense of a marriage and no pretense of a marital relationship, but rather it is straightforward sexual abuse. That is the more rare type of situation. The more common, unfortunately, that we have seen repeatedly in our community is where an imam uses his position as an imam to convince women, normally, but not always, converts, to marry him, although this imam is already married, and to marry him in secret, pursuant to a secret contract, in a secret relationship, and to consummate the marriage through some form of sexual relationship or another. But eventually, the woman discovers that she doesn't have any of the rights or obligations or position or the recognition of a wife, that she has simply been used sexually and quite often discarded. In the case of this recent situation where this man passed away, there were allegations of female victims that have been misled or influenced to enter into marital relations. The rub, the issue, is that rather typical of our community. When this man died, everyone was in the mood to remember all the good he's done and to thoroughly ignore the rights of the victims of sexual use and sexual abuse. And not surprisingly, these women felt re-violated and re-traumatized because what they've been through didn't matter to the Muslim community. And as normally these things go, the victims were told that in Islam, when someone dies, we don't talk about their misdeeds. We only talk about the good that they've done. And as expected, as it has become the norm, unfortunately, in our Muslim community, the victims were told that the Prophet ﷺ said, اذكروا محاسن موتاكم وكفوا عن مساويهم. That the Prophet ﷺ taught us to only speak about the good of the good that the dead have done, and to abstain and refrain from talking about any misdeeds they might have done. And for years now, I have seen this type of situation where women, normally women, suffer sexual abuse, and they are told by the community that exposing their abuser is un-Islamic. And then in this situation, if their abuser passes away, they are told that we can only speak about the good that their abuser did, but none of the bad. The immorality in this is rather obvious, because we are making choices as to whose rights we uphold and whose rights we disregard. Don't kid yourself, and don't blame God for your decision. You voluntarily, God presents you with in life with choices, and the choices often have a tension between rights of human beings. Whose right do you honor and whose right do you de-emphasize and ignore? That's a choice. That's a choice. That's a moral choice. Do you focus on the rights of a man who might have served God in certain regards? Or do you focus on the rights of victims who have been used and discarded after whatever function they've played in a man's life? Let's go first to that famous hadith, "Uzkuru mahasina mawtakum," only speak well of the dead. Although this hadith is recorded in Sunan Abu Dawood and in Sunan Tirmizi, and also recorded in a Mustadrak by al-Hakim and in Sunan al-Bayhaqi, al-Tirmizi and al-Tabari, as well as al-Bayhaqi, themselves comment that this hadith is problematic because of its chain of transmission. It is narrated from a man called Ata, who says that he's heard it on Abdullah ibn Umar. But the problem is that all the narration goes back to this fellow known as, or the Ata says he heard Abdullah ibn Umar say this from the Prophet. In other words, Abdullah ibn Umar says, "I've heard the Prophet said." And Ata says, "I've heard Abdullah ibn Umar said." But all these ahadith go back to a man called Umran ibn Anas al-Makki. And Umran ibn Anas al-Makki was an unreliable narrator of hadith. There is disagreement on whether he was dishonest, in other words, whether he invented hadith, or whether he was used as a placeholder by inventors of hadith. In other words, whether inventors of hadith use Amran's name without Amran himself having said anything. In all cases, As had been recognized by hadith scholars for a long time, this hadith is weak. And even the modern scholar of hadith, Albani, has categorized it as a weak hadith. Yet, so much injustice and so much immorality is justified on the basis of a hadith that, through the technicalities of the science of hadith, is recognized as unreliable. However, often Muslims in this situation will tell you, yes, perhaps this hadith is weak, but aren't there other hadiths where the Prophet said, alayhi salatu wasalam, speak well of the dead? For instance, hasn't the Prophet said, لا تسبوا الأموات فإنهم قد أفضوا إلى ما قدموا? Don't curse the dead because their affairs now are with God. Hasn't the Prophet said, إذا ما مات صاحبكم فدعوه لا تقعوا فيه? If your companion dies, don't speak ill of that friend or that companion. Hasn't the Prophet said, لا تذكروا هلكاكم إلا بخير? Only mention good things about the dead? Hasn't the Prophet said, لا تسبوا أمواتنا فتؤذوا أحياءنا? Don't speak ill of the dead so you do not hurt their relatives or their loved ones. All of these ahadith, although less famous, are more reliable than uskuru mahasina mawtakum. Although more reliable, but less famous. But all of these ahadith, as Muslim jurists recognized centuries ago, as if we have to keep reinventing the ball all over again and again in the modern world. All of these ahadith teach a general moral rule. And the general rule is that once a person dies, forget your petty disputes. Forget your personal grievances. Once a person dies, it is time to let go of petty grievances and petty disputes. And as a general matter, to learn to honor the dead and not disrespect them. However, this must be understood in the light of the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us in the Quran, لا يحب الله الجهر بالسوء من القول إلا من ظلم. Allah does not forbid and in fact encourages those who suffered an injustice to speak up. Refrain from ill talk, but do not refrain from speaking up if you've suffered an injustice. Moreover, the Prophet ﷺ is reported in another hadith that has an authentic status. That he was passing by and he heard people speak well of a dead person. And the Prophet ﷺ responded, wajabat, wajabat, which means, in this context, may Allah accept. And then on another occasion, he passed by and he heard people speak ill of a person who had just died. And the Prophet ﷺ said, wajabat, wajabat, means may Allah accept or may Allah answer your prayers. The meaning of this hadith is that a person who leaves a good legacy, may Allah accept. But a person who leaves a bad legacy, may also Allah accept. In the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ goes on to explain, Antum shuhada, your role is to witness the deeds of a person. Meaning, you witness the deeds of the living. So when they die, if their deeds were good, you speak about these deeds. And if the deeds were bad, you also have an obligation to witness and testify about these deeds. Notice that in the second hadith, the Prophet ﷺ didn't hear these people speak ill of the dead man and said, he did not say to them, stop speaking ill of him. If the reputation that this man left was a bad reputation, so be it. That's what he's left. And here, the Prophet doesn't say to these people, stop criticizing what he's done, or stop exposing what he's done, or don't you dare speak ill of this or that. However, as most scholars recognized centuries ago, is that this all goes back to a juristic principle. حقوق العباد مبنية على المشاحة وحقوق الله مبنية على المسامحة. Meaning that when it comes to the rights of people, the standing principle is that there is a presumptive demand to fulfill the rights of people, and a presumptive demand that the entire community is obligated to fulfill the rights of people. And when it comes to the rights of God, the presumptive demand is forgiveness. In other words, we as a community are obligated to address the rights of those people whose rights have been violated before all else. Apply this to our situation. Just because they are women, it doesn't mean that they do not matter. Just because they are violated sexually, it doesn't mean that it's their fault. Just because we like to puff up our imams at the expense of less illustrious and less connected and less celebrated men doesn't mean that we ignore the rights of these women. The whole community is bound to fulfill the rights of those whose rights have been violated. When a man dies, and the whole community jumps on hadith that they have not studied, they don't understand the context of these hadiths, they don't understand the jurisprudence surrounding these hadiths, but cite these hadiths in order to idealize a male figure at the expense of women victims, then it's time for real scholars to speak up and say that's unethical, that's immoral, that's not right, this is not Islam, this is not Sharia. Men who use their charisma, men who use their superior knowledge of the Sunnah and the Quran, men who use their purported closeness to Allah to obtain license to the bodies of women, do not act in a righteous manner. And when the community covers up for these men, the community becomes complicit in the crimes of these men. These women are not just violated by their abuser or the person who exploited them, but then they are re-violated by the entire community. Do you really think that Allah will bless or support or aid or help a community that uses and abuses the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ in order to dismiss and ignore and wave away the rights of abused women or exploited women or misdirected women or women who were misled? Do you think that Allah will look at this and say, yeah, I'm fine with that? If you do, you're deluded. If you do, then you are not Muslim. Then you don't understand what Islam is about. You don't understand what the Quran is about. You don't understand what the seerah and the sunnah is about. If you do, then you are just a continuation of the tradition of misogyny and exploitation and abuse. When do we Muslims learn that Allah gave us an overriding principle that trumps all? An overriding principle that trumps all, and is summed up in one word: al-haqq. Al-haqq. Truth, morality, righteousness. And when Allah said that those who are silent before al-haqq, as-sakit an al-haqq, shaytanun akhras, those who are silent when there is a right involved, they are like silent devils. Allah compared those who do not see people's rights. And as we said, the juristic principle is that the rights of people come before the rights of God. How about a community that doesn't see the rights of people? How about a community that looks haqq right in the face and says, no, there are other priorities. We have to uphold the reputation of our whatever, our friends, our students, our male network. What do you think Allah does with a community like that? What do you say about a religion that supposedly tells women, swallow your pride, live with your humiliation and your indignity, and just suffer in silence, because the men of your community cannot be bothered. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم صلى الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين. Unfortunately, in so many Muslim communities, increasingly, we keep hearing of scandals. Some of these scandals actually progressed to the point that the police became involved and imams were arrested, and sometimes imams were even convicted and even sentenced to prison. But for every imam who abuses people in his community and is arrested and sent to prison, there are 10 imams who are never exposed, never arrested, and never sent to prison. It is only in extreme cases, or in cases where there happens to be in the community a parent who's willing to break ranks and go to the police, where we find an imam actually exposed and arrested. But these cases are truly alarming, because frequently they involve an imam and they involve underage girls who are entrusted to the imam because the parents want their children to learn Quran or to learn the Sunnah and Seerah of the Prophet. And then the imam abuses this trust and violates the minors, and in some cases even violates people who are of age, in other words, not minors. But there is an enormous amount of pressure upon our children and upon our women to keep their mouths shut and not expose the imam. The problem is that we don't vet our imams. The problem is that we live in a world of pietistic affectations. If someone has a good memory and can rattle off Quranic verses and can rattle off hadith regardless of whether they have been properly vetted for their qualifications and their moral character, the community falls for such a person very easily. The problem is there are so many who are computer scientists or engineers, or they own a business somewhere, and they are so eager to be with minors, to teach minors, and we don't ask ourselves, why are they so eager to be left alone with minors? Just because they go around speaking religious talk to the parents doesn't mean that they're trustworthy or reliable. But more importantly, and this is far more important than the outside garb, and far more important than all the religious symbolism that we engage in, is to teach our children dignity and pride, and to tell them very frankly and very bluntly, if you think you're being touched improperly, it is absolutely necessary that you come talk to your parents, and that your parents will provide you with a safe space. And that when the parents go to those who are responsible in the community, that in turn the parents would be provided with a safe space to discuss the concerns of their children. It is imperative that we not say, oh, well, listen, he recites the Quran so beautifully. Well, listen, he talks about all the sunnah of the Prophet all the time. Listen, he made X number of girls wear the hijab. So it can't be. If there is an allegation, it is morally and Islamically incumbent upon the community to act promptly, to investigate and to protect. The ripple effects of an abusive imam upon a community destroys an entire generation. I know so many children who were sexually abused by imams and grew up to resent Islam, resent the Muslim community, and resent anything Islamic. Some of them became addicts, and some of them even became sex workers. That's the reality. We can't put our head in the sand and say, but Allah said there must be 4 witnesses. If only people bother to be educated. The 4 witnesses is in the context of a formal prosecution by the state, where the demand of the state is to apply the criminal penalty for adultery or fornication. But aside from that particular procedure, when the issue is whether to protect a minor or not protect a minor, you don't need the 4 witnesses. When the issue is whether to terminate someone's employment, you don't need the 4 witnesses. When the issue is whether to stay married to a person or not stay married to a person, you don't need the 4 witnesses. Stop acting like lawyers who know what they're doing, because you don't. Have the humility to admit that you know nothing about law, because you're not trained as lawyers. You're not trained as jurists. And rely on morality, not law, because you're qualified to speak for ethics, but you're not qualified to pretend to be jurists. It is a crime that you will be held responsible for in the hereafter if you do not encourage the abused to speak up and provide a safe space for the abused, and not just a safe place, but a warm, comforting shoulder and support and understanding and a clear communication. We would rather have someone who can't recite the Quran lead prayer than have someone who recites the Quran beautifully but is otherwise an abuser and a morally decrepit human being. This is the talk of haqq. This is how haqq sounds like. The voice of haqq is pure and clean and sensible and sensible and straightforward. The voice of haqq is not convoluted. It doesn't do cartwheels. It doesn't sit there and use this tradition or that tradition, or the voice of haqq is as clear and pure as the Sirat al-Mustaqim. And the haqq is, there have been too many abuses by religious symbols. And the haqq is, we must protect our children and our women from abuse. And the haqq is that the abused grow up to be a problem for themselves and for others, and it is our fault. هدانا الله وأصلح حالنا يا رب. اللهم اغفر لنا واعف عنا وارحمنا واهدنا واصلح حالنا. اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا علي يا عظيم يا رب العالمين. Allah forgive our sins. Allah guide us towards our straight path. Allah grant us the light, your light, so that we may come closer to you, and so that we might grow morally and ethically in your path, Ya Ali Ya Azim. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وقم الصلاة.